So I broke one of my own rules. Instead of taking public transportation, I live in the city, or I should say I live in Manhattan. I'm from Queens, which is also part of New York City, but when you're from Queens, when you say the city, you mean Manhattan. Anyway, I never drive from Manhattan or to Manhattan from anywhere else in the city. My schedule yesterday was a little weird, and I missed my opportunity to catch the train out to Long Island, where I had plans to have lunch with my daughter, and lunch turned into a very early dinner because it took me about 3 hours to get there. Again, see rule 1. I was probably about 15 minutes out from where we were meeting when one of the worst places possible, the Cross Island Parkway, I got a flat tire. There was no way I was going to pull over to the shoulder because it's a parkway, tow trucks can't get there. It literally is the worst place to stop your car. So I luckily was right by an exit, and I was able to park on a residential street in Queens, my old stomping grounds. See? So anyway, it's the next day. I woke up this morning knowing that this is what I had to deal with, and I was really depressed about it. I felt unable to figure out the logistics. It just felt completely overwhelming. And honestly, that's been happening a lot lately. Things that normally I would take in stride, I might be annoyed by them, but I wouldn't feel undone by them, have come to feel just completely unbearable. And I've been trying to figure out why. That's life, just have to adapt and roll with it. That's not how I was feeling this morning. I've been trying to piece together what is happening, and it's not surprising. I mean, it shouldn't surprise any of us, but it's the context. It's the times in which we live, and being inundated with news every day that is sometimes disheartening, sometimes infuriating, sometimes demoralizing, sometimes all of those things at once, feeling completely out of control, knowing that in less than 30 days, a very significant number of Americans are going to go to the polls and vote for fascism. It's kind of hard to take, and I think it does make everything else that goes wrong, even if it's relatively minor, seem like a bigger deal than it is. For a while now, I've been very conscious of the fact that I have been waiting for this election to be over. By which I mean I've been getting it into my head that, okay, there's work to be done. Everything else has to be put on hold. And by everything else, it seems to be, life. And I'm reminded of a time I did this in the past. I worked in the admissions ward at a state psychiatric hospital. When I applied for the job, I lived in Manhattan. When I got the job, I lived on Long Island. So instead of having a kind of pain in the ass, but not too terrible commute on public transportation, I had a 3-hour round trip in a car. So that was pretty stressful. Also, when you work in the admissions ward of a psych hospital, you are seeing, evaluating, and treating patients when they're at their absolute sickest. And because it was a state hospital, a lot of our patients had little to no support system. And even when they did have families, a lot of times families were not the slightest bit interested in being involved in the patient's care or in the patient's in supporting the patient after they got released. So it was pretty difficult work. Also, for the first 6 months I was there, I had to work on the sex offenders ward, running groups for people who were rapists and serial sexual assaulters, and also in some cases pedophiles. And that's probably the hardest work I've ever done in my life. I had a nightmare every night for 6 months. So when the year was half over, some of my colleagues and I, because it was a year-long placement, some of my colleagues and I had a calendar in the lounge, and we would X off every day. And I just literally was counting the days for 6 months. The day after I finished, my daughter had her very first day of kindergarten, so it was her first time being in school full time. And, you know, I still had to write my dissertation. I still had to do research for that. I was teaching part-time at night, but I don't think my teaching gig had started yet. I didn't have any schedule. I hadn't made any plans, and I was sitting in my living room, and I remember thinking, what do I do now? Because I just hadn't thought ahead. I was so desperate for it to be over that that's all I focused on. And it kind of feels like the same thing that I'm doing now, with this exception. I think part of the reason I'm kind of putting everything on hold is because it's very difficult to imagine what our lives are going to be like after November 5th, isn't it? I mean, I had a similar sensation in 2020, but the consequences seem so much more severe now. And the difference between one administration and the other seems so much more diametrically opposed, even though I know that that's not something you can qualify, because diametrically opposed is diametrically opposed. How do you envision what's going to happen when we're either going to be living in a weakened, struggling democracy that has another chance to set itself right, or living in a fascist America with a leader who wants nothing more than vengeance? I don't know. So this is my advice, my totally unsolicited advice, that I also am going to take. Don't put anything on hold. As I mentioned, I was in a pretty bad mood this morning. That's actually not a bad mood. Like, as I said, I was depressed. I was feeling very exhausted, and I wasn't sure how I was going to put one foot in front of the other to handle what seemed like this gargantuan, complicated task of getting my car towed so I could get a new tire, which, by the way, is something that's happened to me a few times in my life. But I got outside, and it's a stunningly beautiful day here in Queens, New York. I was going to change the tire myself, but of course, one of the pieces that I needed to get the lug nuts off was missing. So luckily, even though it's about to be a high holy day, I was able to get a tow truck to come in the next 45 minutes. I'm out in the world, and there are a lot of things not just to look forward to either way, but to do in the meantime. So that is sort of my pledge, just to be out in the world and hug a tree, go to a museum, go to a park and read a novel. That's all still there for the taking, regardless. Or I should say, especially because of how hard everything else is. I will catch you on the other side of having a tire that's not really flat.